Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Star Wars episode reviews. This is going to be for The Mandalorian Season 3 Episode 4 and also The Bad Batch Season 2 Episode 14. So we've got one more week of The Bad Batch. I believe it is going to be a 2-episode finale. So it means that I think next week I'm probably going to have to do 2 separate videos so I can give The Bad Batch finale its kind of time to shine. But yeah, we're talking about both episodes today. As ever, I'll start with The Mandalorian. So straight away, the first thing you'll probably note about this episode is that it is quite short. It's only listed at 30 minutes on the kind of timer thing, but actually really only 27 minutes of actual content when you take out the credits and the previously on. But it was still a very good episode. Obviously, there's a bit of whiplash going from what last week's episode was back to this, but obviously it's more last week's episode that's the kind of odd one out, but also it's weird that now that we introduced that, we just immediately went away from it. Now, to be fair, I suppose it's highlighting that, don't forget, cloning is a kind of core part of this series, that ultimately I suppose Grogu is going to come back into focus. And it is interesting that both of these shows are airing at the same time. That Bad Batch and Mandalorian are both ultimately dealing with this kind of cloning topic, both from kind of opposite sides, effectively. Where this is more of the kind of early setup for this kind of cloning program, and then we're getting sort of almost the setup for the final stage to set up the sequel trilogy. That's sort of what we're doing here. But we are talking about Mandalorian here, of course. And so what we got in this episode was some time with the covert. So we got to just sort of see what it's like on a more day-to-day basis. We've seen a little bit of this. It was interesting that they showed you the recap of the young boy who obviously gets captured in this episode. Him, kind of Paz Vizsla's son, reciting the oath and, that sort of thing. But we also do get to see Grogu starting his journey as a foundling sort of properly here. In the middle of the episode, we obviously get part of the flashback of basically how Grogu ended up in the situation he was in at the start of The Mandalorian. Now, we still have to see the rest of that, but it was a really good step on that journey. And then we got the rescue mission for, what was his name, Ragnar. Yeah, Vizsla, I guess. So let's start with the beginning. Let's just go kind of through this in order. So Grogu has a kind of foundling sparring match challenge against Ragnar. And it's decided that what Grogu's going to do, they're going to do the dart shooter challenge. So they each are given this kind of paint dart shooter to test, I suppose, their accuracy, kind of quick draw type situation. And basically what happens here is that it's kind of first to 3 wins. Ragnar really quickly gets the first 2 shots on Grogu, and Grogu doesn't even have a chance to fight. And after that, Din sort of inspires him to be show them what you can do. You don't have to hide here. Basically, use your abilities. And so in the kind of final round, quote unquote, Grogu uses his kind of force-assisted movement, hops around the place a little bit, and is just and does all 3 shots in one go. And so he wins his kind of first foundling match. Now, this is meant to play into the plot a little bit, in that this obviously frustrates Ragnar, and so he kind of goes off to train on his own a little bit, kind of out on his own, and so he actually then gets picked off and captured by the giant kind of bird creature of the episode. And this sets up the plot of basically, who is it? It's Paz Vizsla, the Mandalorian, and Bo-Katan, plus a few others, are going to go after him to get him back, because as part of the covert, they do, of course, want to protect the foundlings. So this needs to happen, and they do set up straight away that, we didn't fully know ahead of time that this is Paz Vizsla's son, but you, I think, get that before it's even revealed in the episode, that he is quite eager to go off on this mission. But interestingly, Bo-Katan is the one to suggest this rescue mission, and she does a lot of the kind of initial reconnaissance, chasing it, finding its location, and so she gets to be the leader on this, even though she's just joined the covert. So that is a bit of an interesting setup. Grogu, of course, doesn't go with the Mandalorian. It's too dangerous on this specific mission. So he stays behind and has an interesting scene with the armorer. So he goes inside, and we obviously get a sort of echo type scene where, like, we saw the Mandalorian have a little bit of a flashback as the armorer hammered away at the forge. And so as this is happening with Grogu, he too has a flashback. And so what we get here is basically, how did Grogu escape the temple? We were told this before, that he got out of the temple, and of course, just by the logic of he's here now, where he ended up, he had to escape the temple. But we get how exactly that happens, but we still don't have the full story. So we get another Order 66 flashback, but they don't linger on it, I think, like a massive amount. It's clear that this is just another small plot happening in the middle of all the chaos happening. Jedi are getting gunned down. They are trying to protect Grogu, the youngling here, and get him to this Jedi Master, Caloran. And so a bunch of Jedi go down as they get him into one of the kind of elevators, grav lifts, whatever they call it in Star Wars. Heads down, door opens, and boom, Ahmed Best Jedi. So if you don't know Ahmed Best, he is the actor who is the guy in the suit for Jar Jar. He is Jar Jar Binks, basically. So really cool that he gets to have a sort of, just full on, not in a costume performance here. Now, this character has been known about before. I'm not super familiar with the original source of this character, but it was some sort of a kind of challenge, kind of game show type thing from like 2 or 3 years ago, where Ahmed Best was this Jedi character. So this is basically them making this character, I think, properly canon for the first time, because the whole game show thing, like, it's hard to justify that as being super, super canon. But this fully makes the character quite important. Plays a role in Grogu's story, and is still alive at the end of this part of the flashback. So we get a cool, like, escape sequence here, where you obviously get the contrast between sort of like the knights, or sort of lower level masters, being gunned down, and then Caloran here picks up one of the dead Jedi's lightsabers and is dual wielding for a while, blocking blaster bolts. So he does one of the cool things that you always like to see a bit of, referencing a lot of the prequel era combat, of just the Jedi using the Force in combination with their lightsabers. Just like block, block, block. Oh, there's one left. Force push. So many of the other ones you feel like in the scene just before that could have just like do some Force stuff and save yourself from this. This is why a lot of those like cutscene kind of trailer scenes for like the Old Republic game were so cool. They made a big effort to always utilize the Force in combat, and that was one of the cooler parts of prequel combat that's kind of been a little bit forgotten in some of the more recent fights, of just, occasional uses of Force pushes and stuff like that, while still having good choreography. But, getting across how skilled this character is. So, big chase scene through kind of Coruscant here as things go wrong. He's going to get Grogu out. There's a bit of a speeder chase. Some of the gunships with the clones get taken out. But eventually what happens here is they manage to escape Coruscant by him leading Grogu to a Naboo ship, where there's a bunch of Naboo guards there who immediately are just like, Caloran, what's going on? They kind of sacrifice themselves to allow him to get on board the ship, and they go into hyperspace. Now, I'm not really sure where we're going from here. Like, you would assume the ship probably has built-in program, like, hyperspace coordinates for Naboo, given that it's a Naboo ship. So it would make sense to a certain degree that, like, okay, well, we're going to go hang out in Naboo. Because it would seem like one of the safer places, because of the whole kind of Padme connection. But it would allow potentially Palpatine to maybe be a little bit aware, keeping track of Grogu if he cares at all, because he's from Naboo. So, I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see what happens from here, because obviously we have to keep in mind it's still Order 66, so the Jedi are being hunted. It becomes public knowledge. Like, Caloran is going to have to be undercover from basically this point out. What happens here? So it's clear they get separated at some point, and Grogu ends up being targeted. So what exactly happens here? So still quite a bit more of the story to go in that, like, I don't think I feel like you probably have to do maybe 2-3 more of these. I don't think it could just be like there's one more half of the story, but who knows? They might simplify it. This was a quite effective use of just a couple of minutes to tell us actually quite a bit about what happened here. So even though it's more of the obvious section of the story, literally just how he escaped the temple, we still have to find out where exactly they are heading. So that's that. And so when we come out of this, it's revealed that what the armorer was making while this was all happening was basically, what she call it, a rondelle? Basically like a chest kind of plate piece of armor for Grogu, which is a big circular thing. Puts it on Grogu that like you'll kind of grow into this. It looks quite big on him right now, but you know, you'll grow into this. And so this is, again, he is a foundling. He's passed part of his test, so he gets another piece of armor. And you know, he's making some progress here. And it was just nice to see that, like, you know, she's treating Grogu just like any of the other foundlings for the most part. So let's see how exactly this all goes. There is some discussion about the whole idea of like, oh, he's not old enough to wear a helmet yet, and the idea of like, are we even going to give him the helmet? Because I still think that's probably a plot point that we are going to have to explore at some point, is that it feels like some decision is going to be made about if the keeping the helmet on at all times thing should be a thing going forward or not. Because it's going to be weird if suddenly, like I say, like 3 of our main characters, Bo, Din, and Grogu, just always wear helmets. We never get to see their face for the most part. And we just go from there. But interesting. It does mean, like, okay, what's going to prompt the next part of the flashback from Grogu? Because, okay, they seem to be happening when they do stuff with the armorer, but is he going to get another piece of armor anytime soon? We're not really sure about that. Because I suppose what you're thinking about with Grogu is that, like, it feels like he needs his own weapon. And you ultimately feel like you kind of want him to probably have a lightsaber, because it's kind of fitting for, like, a Jedi Mandalorian, but they're almost leading him down the path of like he's not going to be a Jedi anymore. But then like he's having the flashback, he's remembering the Jedi saving him, so there is that slight kind of conflict there, and you sort of wonder, like, is he going to be, you know, like given like a blaster at some point, given like a vibroblade, and it doesn't suit him, but then, you know, he does something with the Darksaber and it ends up working out, or what. But then, like, what are we doing? Like, are we going to eventually go back to Luke and get Yoda's lightsaber to give to him? I'm not really sure about that, because they made a point in like the Book of Boba Fett of highlighting that he made his choice. So I'm not really sure about that one. But in the rest of the episode, the mission to get the boy back. Interestingly, we had a scene addressing the whole, how do we eat? She's just like, hey, Din, hey, how do I eat if we're not meant to take our helmets off? And it's just like, oh yeah, you just go off on your own and like take your helmet off and eat. It seems really awkward. Like, they're just all at the campfire and it's like, oh, dinner time. And they all just leave, and it's just like, oh, well, Bo, you're technically the leader on this mission. You get to stay by the campfire. And she's just kind of like, no one's around, like, I guess, am I allowed to do this? And she's just awkwardly eating and just being like, okay, this works, but it's also odd. So they're still highlighting that, like, there's a family atmosphere here, there's a sense of care, it is Mandalorian culture, but there are elements of, like, the cult aspect that do hit you every so often. But even the armorer, who's like the leader of this quote-unquote cult, seems all right, and like she's helping Grogu, she's giving armor to like Bo and Din and Grogu, so you know there's nothing like particularly ominous here. So it just seems to be a little bit of a case of like some of the customs here in the group are just a little bit beyond what I think most people feel is kind of like normal, or like particularly like comfortable necessarily, just like practical basically, because it really feels like if they just relax things with the helmet, there's a lot here that would be okay. If they maybe limited how often they said this is the way and just relaxed the helmet stuff a little bit, this feels like it would all be like relatively fine as a warrior focused kind of group, with what's going on here. Otherwise, it actually seems okay. So, that's what we build up to. So they climb the cliff with the grappling hooks, because of course they have to go in kind of quiet, because they're worried if they go in kind of guns blazing that, one, they might hit the child because they don't know where he is. Two, if they spook the animal too much, who knows what might happen. He might get thrown off the cliff. They might just go ahead and eat him or whatever. But when they get up there, they actually find that there are three kind of baby kind of bird creatures. And actually the Rangar has already been swallowed, but he does get spit out because the bird has to kind of fight. And we get this kind of pretty crazy but kind of nice action scene where the characters are all using their jet packs, grappling onto the bird while it's flying, trying to take it down. And it's pretty good what happens here. Like, Din ends up saving Paz Vizsla's son, while Bo and like the others kind of do most of the damage to the bird to take it down into the ground. And I think the idea is that they do manage to quote unquote kill it, because I think that's the only way it works out, because when they come back, big celebration of course, but they bring back the three baby birds. So they now have these animals to, I suppose, ride on, and I guess they'll gain the trust of these and they can use them as kind of flying mounts, which is kind of interesting as a concept. It probably suggests there probably has to be a time skip at some point for them to be like to age enough to be actually used properly as flying mounts, but we'll see what happens there, because it feels like, oh well, maybe some of the younger members could fly on them while they're quite young, like the likes of Grogu. If you're going to do anything with Paz Vizsla's son, they could be ones who use these kind of birds to fly around on, maybe before they get jetpacks. That would be kind of cool. But the big thing here is that, like, Bo is celebrated having led this mission. She is credited with like saving a foundling, which is one of the best things you can do within the Creed. And immediately it's just like, oh, you've lost a piece of armor. We will remake that for you. And so we get a bit of a armorer and Bo-Katan scene. And it's nice because it's just, she makes the missing pauldron. But she asks, like, oh, do you want the Night Owl symbol again or what? And Bo's actually like, what about the mythosaur? Can I have the one I have remain Night Owl, but this one be mythosaur? And it's explained that, yes, the mythosaur is available to all Mandalorians. If you don't have a specific symbol, the mythosaur is just the kind of like default one. That's perfectly fine. And so that's what ends up happening here. But interestingly, Bo-Katan mentions a living mythosaur. Like, I saw one, basically. And the response from the armorer is weird, because she initially is just like, oh, you must have thought you saw it or something like that. That's a good test of faith and all this sort of stuff. But then she's like, no, it was real. I definitely saw one. And the response is just, this is the way. So it's like, what are you meant to take away from that? Because I don't think it was full on like dismissal of like, I don't believe you. But it's like, we're not going to deal with that right now. Because I think that's what we're waiting for, is at some point, I get the impression that Bo and or Din are eventually going to be like, this is cool what we're doing here, but shouldn't we also be trying to go back to Mandalore and like rebuild our society full stop? Why are we just sticking around here by these caves? Like, is this the right way? Should we not be doing this? And this might prompt a little bit of debate about if they want to move, if there's a safety in what they're doing here, and there's maybe a risk to going back because it would make Mandalore kind of like public again on a broader scale. And this is probably going to be what eventually prompts a little bit of a discussion between all the characters about what is the right way to go about doing things, because otherwise it seems like things are going well in the covert. Din is happily helping Grogu to kind of train and rise through the ranks. Bo has immediately incorporated herself like pretty well into things overall. But we know these characters have bigger goals. Din, I think, cares a little bit about Mandalore and would like to do something because he was there and saw what happened. Bo, of course, has had her kind of faith in a way like reignited because she literally saw a new living mythosaur. And a lot of what she thought was just kind of like fake things associated with her culture are now real. So she's going through a lot in terms of like, this is cool. I'm around my people, but they're a little bit cult-like, but it's also kind of like a family, so it's good, but isn't enough. And I think we know that she is more ambitious than this, so what's going to happen here? The other thing is, like, I thought, like, the Darksaber would get addressed at some point in all of this, like, you know, in terms of like Din maybe doing more training, would he have used it at some point? But didn't really get brought up. So there's a few things that I feel like needs to happen. Because one of the big things I still have is like, basically, who is the armorer? Because it's interesting that they're addressing the whole never take your helmet off situation, but it's also like, wait, you're talking to like the princess and then our new like important character Din. Who are you? Why are you the leader of this covert? Like, who did you used to be or not? And there's a bit of a mystery here about, like, does Bo know who it is just based on the voice? Or is there meant to be some sort of a kind of, like, twist in all of this that, like, she maybe discovers the identity of who it is underneath that and there's some kind of crazy thing that actually goes down? Because, as people have pointed out, like, she's the only one who has horns on her helmet. And the only other time we saw horns on a Mandalorian helmet was the kind of Mandalorians from the Clone Wars. So is it one of those kind of loyalists still remaining or what? There's some confusion there, but, you know, interesting stuff overall. But yeah, because it was a short episode, it felt like we maybe didn't progress as much as we wanted to. And it makes me wonder, like, are we just going to get, like, the next half of Grogu's backstory in the next episode? Or do we have to wait a little bit and then we'll come back to it? Will that like lead up to like the finale being a big event plus this? Because it's hard to really predict exactly where we're going because the show has shown that it can just be like casual, like fun times in the covert, but it can also be, and we'll cut over and do like a 60-minute deep dive into Dr. Pershing and this New Republic amnesty program. But we'll do Grogu's backstory if we have to. So there's an element of kind of surprise with this show as well that's quite surprising. Very redundant statement I just said there, but you know, it's interesting that there are many options for an episode of The Mandalorian at this point, now that they've introduced all these different avenues. So I wonder if we'll return to many of them and so on. Because again, like there's a relatively few amount of episodes in the season of The Mandalorian, so we're approaching kind of like the halfway point already. So that is quite interesting. So at this point, I'll move over to the Bad Batch. So this is the episode directly before the two-part finale. So it's meant to be our sort of finale setup, and that's definitely the way it kind of comes across. It's very much a setup episode. You don't precisely know where exactly we're heading with some of this stuff. Bit of a mystery setup, but they are definitely teasing the idea that the Bad Batch will come into contact with Crosshairs again. But will it be the Crosshairs who seems to now have the potential to rejoin up with them? Because that's the kind of tease here, is our new Doctor character here. He seems to be, they seem to be teasing, like in a way, referencing the Mandalorian crossover with the Bad Batch stuff. Is this the guy who kind of makes the mind warping thing? Because that's kind of what they're suggesting here, is that like, if I, use my skills to their maximum, I can basically turn you into a zombie completely under the Empire's control. And I think what they're teasing here is that the clone assassin from the political episode, the guy who was fully loyal to the Empire, I think he is someone who has undergone the process by this Doctor, and that's what they're sort of teasing is going to happen to Crosshairs here. Now, is this just going to be what happens here, and like will we address, like, can he break out of it or not? will they further tease the tragic kind of nature of Crosshairs, that he can never get back together with his team? It'll be interesting to see what exactly they do with that. But yeah, they tease an escape. He doesn't get far because it's revealed that, of course, the Doctor is immune to his own gas, but he can shut everyone else down with it, and that he wants to use Crosshairs to basically get Omega. Because again, the plot here is that there's a few layers to this. Like, it's, they need to find the Bad Batch because they need Omega, and they need Omega because in controlling Omega, they'll control Nala Se, and they need Nala Se because she has advanced cloning information and experience. Now, I do think we're eventually building up to probably some sort of a bigger reveal about Omega herself. Because I know a lot of people have latched on to potentially the idea that our female kind of scientist character in this episode, it's interesting, she has this sort of New Zealand accent. Is there something going on there? Because it feels like she was being somewhat nice to Crosshairs, and it's notable he stunned her, killed the other guards. Is there a setup that she'll help Crosshairs in some way? I'm not really sure. Like, is there going to be some crazy reveal that there's more female clones of Jango Fett and she's one of them somehow, or something like that? I'm not really sure. But everyone, I think, is definitely in the mood for some sort of a big reveal to happen in the finale. I don't think it happened here. It absolutely didn't happen here. But it feels like that's what we're building towards. So the big point of kind of connection is that Crosshairs, as he's escaping, does manage to get out a message that is basically, what is it, like Plan 88, which they then decode later on as being, this is the plan that basically says that the group is being targeted, and they're wondering, is this just to lure us in, or has he actually turned against the Empire? Because, of course, they find out that he was on this basically, like, prison facility, so that would suggest he's turned in some way, but is it just to lure us in? Because, of course, they want Crosshairs to sort of give up the group's position, and in broadcasting this, and maybe them wanting to go save him, that kind of does lure them in. So, interesting stuff there. On the kind of slightly less interesting side of things, I still maintain that the Bad Batch themselves have had an incredibly slow plot over the course of this season. Even in this episode, like, I think it's just very frustrating to hear Hunter talk about some of this stuff. Like, I appreciate it, like, we get the return of Echo, they meet up again, and Hunter and Echo do have a little bit of a talk about, should we stay here, or should we get involved in what you're doing, and basically grouping up clones to act against the Empire. And Hunter's very much in the idea of, like, they're too powerful, we have to kind of think about ourselves, we have to think about Omega, keep her safe. But they've also sort of been teasing a little bit of the idea of, like, what does Omega want to do? Does she just want to be safe, or does she also care about combating the Empire? There's some interesting things that it feels like the group hasn't really talked about or explored. But the problem has been that, like, it's been all season that we've been waiting to do this. It has taken so long for them to finally separate themselves from Sid. And now they are, and I get it, like, I appreciated, like, say, last episode, teasing the idea, what if they just settled down on the planet to escape the Empire? But as we know, like, say, in Andor, you can't just go off to, like, a vacation planet and escape the Empire. There'll always be something. They'll set up camp on that, and they'll get you for something. And that's the error of taking the approach of trying to just hide out from the Empire. It's always not going to kind of work out. Something will happen to either draw you back in, or they will somehow find you. That's always sort of been the setup here. But is this mission, this confrontation, going to be what finally gets us back into things? It's unclear, because I'm pretty sure at this point, like, there has to be a season 3 of the Bad Batch. There's no way we're resolving everything in just 2 episodes. But what is going to be the cliffhanger here? And it feels like they either have to have, I think it's the death of Crosshairs, or Crosshairs rejoins the group. I think one of the two things has to happen. especially after what the season 1 kind of finale was, which was kind of like the tease, but then he doesn't join. It feels like we've built up to he either has to do one of those two things. Sacrifice himself to help the group, redeeming himself in their eyes, or him rejoining actually is a thing that happens. Other side of the episode, I suppose we do have a kind of third faction here. We do get to see a bit of like, you know, Echo / Rex's kind of group in action, and we see that we have like Gregor here. They attack a ship that has some clone prisoners, which they manage to break out. And that's what they're doing. They're kind of like their own separate clone rebel faction that is gathering up other clones. And I think, you know, very clearly what we're doing here is like, I guess this is the setup for the group that eventually is the kind of Rex, Gregor, Wolf kind of trio in Rebels. That what's left of that group or whatever is that. So I think that's kind of what we're doing here, which is kind of interesting, because I don't think we've been introduced to Wolf in this specific kind of era just yet. So I wonder, like, will he come into play at another point? There's also the whole Cody situation of like Cody's kind of there and thereabouts. We had a little bit of a focus on him. Are we going to do anything more there? There's some interesting kind of topics for sure to be brought up. But yeah, I think it's one of those episodes where like I get the setup. I understand what we're trying to do here. But surprisingly, I don't have like, I think, too much to say about this episode in particular, because I felt like it was very much, we will explore these things in the finale. That's kind of what this episode felt like. We'll put a few little things into position. All the characters, for the most part, that are important are back in play now. And now let's see how things play out. I assume we are going to go to this facility where kind of Crosshairs is being held, and we'll get a lot of the kind of key events that we've been kind of waiting for, building up towards. I don't know, like, is there still time to do anything with the whole backlash from Sid situation? But I think they need to have a better setup going into season 3 than the season 1 to 2 situation. I think it took way too long to get going, and I don't think they should just get us back to just on the run kind of status quo. Something kind of bigger has to happen. That means that season 3 should just be we're right back into the thick of things ultimately. So they're my thoughts on both of today's episodes. In the comments, let me know what your thoughts were on both The Mandalorian and the Bad Batch episode. But that has been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.